hikers are coming forward and sharing their bizarre and terrifying experiences with the unknown and unexplainable on Mount Shasta. And in today's episode, we will continue our series and share more bizarre accounts of the unexplained happening all around this mountain. You won't want to miss this one. So this story takes place back in 1983, and at the time, there was this guy named Douglas Vaughn. Now, Douglas, he was working as a part-time contractor for his brother-in-law, and he had just gotten this new apartment that he had saved up for. So basically, Douglas was living that bachelor life. He had just gotten out of a bad relationship, so no girls in the picture at this point. But here's the thing. Around that same time, Douglas started spending a lot more time outdoors, and I mean a lot of time outdoors, especially up at Mount Shasta. Now, if you're not familiar, Mount Shasta is up there in Siskiyou County, California, and let me tell you, if you're looking for some beautiful outdoor spots to just clear your head, you can't beat Mount Shasta, especially in the late spring, early summer months when the weather is just perfect for hiking and exploring. So whenever Douglas wasn't tied down working for his brother-in-law, that's exactly what he would do. He'd head out to Mount Shasta, find himself a nice stream or creek, and just spend hours sitting there or walking around in the woods. And it's important to understand, Douglas wasn't like this hardcore outdoorsman or anything. He was just a regular guy living a pretty boring life. And on this particular day, Douglas is out near the Ash Creek Butte area, somewhere between the road and the mountain. Now, he's not venturing too deep into the backcountry or anything because, like I said, that wasn't really his thing. But he's following this little creek that he's familiar with, one he's walked along before. And it takes him into this meadow area that he recognizes. Only when he steps out of the tree line into the meadow, that's when he notices something off. Because there, no more than maybe 100 yards away, is this old log cabin. And I'm talking like old, straight out of the 1800s almost. And so Douglas is just standing there kind of confused thinking, I don't remember that being there before. And at first he wonders if maybe he took a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in a different meadow than he's used to. But then he starts recognizing certain landmarks, certain trees, and he realizes, no, this is definitely that same familiar meadow he's been to before. Only now there's this old random cabin just smack dab in the middle of it. So he's already feeling a bit weirded out at this point, but his first thought is that maybe it's some kind of historic reconstruction they put up and he just hadn't heard about it because he didn't really follow local news or anything. But then that's when he notices there are people outside the cabin. Specifically, there's this older guy dressed in like full-on 1800s pioneer garb. Dude has a big bushy beard, khaki pants with suspenders, a wool shirt, the whole 9 yards. Like he just stepped straight out of an old Western movie or something. And then there's this girl with him, maybe 10 or 12 years old, and she's wearing one of those prairie-style dresses with an apron. Now seriously, they both look like extras from a Frontier film set. And so now Douglas is starting to feel really confused and out of place. He's thinking maybe he accidentally stumbled onto some kind of live historical reenactment village without realizing it. Only there doesn't seem to be anything else around except this one cabin with the two of them inside. And here's the weird part. They don't even seem to notice Douglas at all. The guy is just tending to this little garden plot while the girl is playing with a rag doll, and neither of them is even glancing this way once. It's like they can't see him or hear him at all. And so Douglas starts calling out, "Hey there, hello," just trying to get their attention. But no response whatsoever. The guy just keeps working in his garden, wiping the sweat from his brow, and the girl just keeps playing with her doll, making it dance around and whispering to it, like kids do. And at this point, Douglas is really starting to feel uneasy about the whole bizarre situation, and part of him is thinking maybe he should just turn around and head back. But his curiosity gets the better of him, and so he tries calling out again, louder this time, "Everything okay over there?" But still nothing. No reaction at all from either of them. It's almost like the guy and the girl exist in their own little world, just completely oblivious to Douglas standing there watching them. And the whole scene just feels surreal and unsettling to him, you know? Like part of him is wondering if he accidentally ate some hallucinogenic mushrooms without realizing it. Although I have no idea how you would do that, because it all seems so vivid and tangible. He can make out every detail of that rundown cabin. He could hear the bugs buzzing, the smell, the earthy sense of the meadow. If this is an hallucination, it's the most coherent one that he's ever had. But then the girl suddenly notices Douglas, and she stops playing with her doll, and her eyes going wide when she sees him standing there. And as soon as she reacts, that's when the man, presumably her father, turns around and also spots Douglas. Only his reaction is much different. His face kind of twists up in shock and fear the second he sees Douglas. He immediately starts shouting something at the girl, who lets out this cry and goes scurrying behind the man's legs, peering out nervously. Meanwhile, the man is shouting these harsh, unintelligible words and gesturing at Douglas like he's warding off a threat. And Douglas, he instinctively takes a step back with his hands up, trying to show he's not a danger, and he's saying, "Easy there, friend, I'm not gonna hurt you." But the man is having none of it. He just keeps yelling in this language Douglas can't make out, scowling and shielding the girl protectively with his body. And the whole confrontation is just adding to Douglas's utter bewilderment over what the heck is happening here. Part of him is wondering if maybe these two are just immigrants who recently settled in the area, explaining their antiquated clothing. But then their total lack of reaction when he first approached doesn't fit with this theory at all. And all of a sudden, the girl lets out another cry of alarm and starts gesturing frantically behind Douglas. And so he spins around just in time to see this massive black bear lumbering out of the trees into the meadow. I mean, this thing is an absolute unit. Teeth bared and everything. It lets out this deafening roar that just makes Douglas's heart literally leap into his throat. And in that moment, he doesn't even think, he just turns and runs in the opposite direction as fast as he can, and he's crashing through the underbrush, not even caring which way he's going. He's just trying to put as much distance between himself and that bear as humanly possible. He doesn't dare look back once. He just runs until his legs are burning and his entire body feels like jelly. Now, finally, he gets to a point where he's exhausted, he can't run anymore, and so he's bending over, he's wheezing, just trying to catch his breath. And as he's kind of sitting there, gulping air, he realizes that not only had he not made it that far, but the meadow, the cabin, the bear, the old-timey people, they're nowhere to be found. It's all gone. No sign of any of the weird stuff he just witnessed. So Douglas starts turning in circles, scanning the area for any trace of that black bear that sent him running for his life, but there's nothing out of the ordinary, just trees and birdsong, like that whole explosive encounter never even happened in the first place. And at this point, his mind is just spinning with all these unanswered questions about what the heck he just experienced. But he knows he needs to get his bearings and try to find his way back to the trailhead before nightfall. Nothing looks familiar at all. It's like the entire landscape had shifted on him while he was running. And by the time night falls, Douglas has to admit to himself that he's completely and utterly lost out in the woods. And it ends up being almost a full day before a search and rescue party finally locates this missing, dehydrated, delirious Douglas, who's stumbling aimlessly through the woods, suffering from heat stroke and exhaustion. And by then, that whole insane experience in the meadow, he can't even really be sure it was real or not. I don't know what the heck Douglas experienced that day. Was it just some sort of strange hallucination, or maybe heat-induced delirium? Or did he somehow glimpse through some kind of rift into the past? I mean, either way, I can't imagine how utterly mind-bending and terrifying that whole situation must have felt for the guy. I mean, getting lost in the woods is scary enough on its own, but throw in a bizarre scene straight out of a frontier ghost story. I mean, that's the stuff of nightmares. And as far as the man and the girl he ran into who appeared to be from a time long past, and the huge question, did he experience a time slip? It will remain unknown. In 1994, a group of college friends, including Jonathan, who was majoring in Middle Eastern studies, decided to go on a camping trip up to Mount Shasta during their spring break. Now, the plan was for it to just be a fun outdoorsy getaway from campus, but Jonathan was low-key hoping he might learn some new perspectives on ancient cultures and legends by being out in nature like that. So they loaded up Jonathan's beat-up old Jeep and headed north from Sacramento, where their school was located. And now the drive took most of the day with stops for gas and whatnot, but by the time they arrived at the campground near the mountain, the sun was already starting to set, and they quickly set up their tents and got a fire going before it got too dark out. And after eating some franks and beans for dinner, Jonathan's friend Eric, who was an amateur stargazer, began pointing out all the different constellations that were pretty visible since they were far away from the city's light pollution. And then this led to Jonathan going off on this one line of long tangents about ancient astronomers and how they used to associate clusters of stars with different mythological stories and creatures from their culture's folk traditions. So as Jonathan was rambling about the mythic symbolism of Scorpius and stuff like that, his friend Sam, who had been standing a little ways away taking a leak, suddenly came bolting back towards the firelight looking really freaked out. And basically, when Sam was over by the tree line, he caught a glimpse through the darkness of what looked like a large shadowy figure observing them from the woods. And he said this thing had these glowing white eyes that seemed to pierce right through him when they made eye contact. And at first, most of the other guys kind of just laughed it off, thinking Sam had either seen some sort of weird tree trunk in the dark and maybe let his imagination run wild, or maybe he was just messing with them. But Sam was adamant that he hadn't imagined it, and he was clearly pretty shaken up. And he said this shadowy thing almost looked human-shaped, but it was hard to make out any distinct features beside those creepy glowing eyes. Now, over the next hour or so, a few more of the guys ended up claiming that they'd seen glimpses of the same shadowy figure lurking around the edges of their campsite whenever they wandered even a little ways away from the fire. Each time somebody saw it, they said it would just stand there or crouch there unnaturally still, almost like it was studying them or something, before disappearing back into the woods as soon as it was noticed. And by this point, the whole group was starting to get pretty spooked, and they were all huddled together close to the fire. And that's when Jonathan remembered reading something in one of his folklore classes about certain Middle Eastern legends of shadowy supernatural entities called Djinn. And they were said to be trickster spirits, capable of taking on all kinds of bizarre forms. So Jonathan just starts going on about how the Djinn were often associated with more remote natural areas like forests or deserts, and he's rambling on, explaining how they were thought to be ancient supernatural beings that predated humans and angels. And some tales portrayed them as mischievous tricksters who got their kicks from tormenting people out in the wilderness, while others painted them as more sinister, malicious entities. But as Jonathan's lecturing, the rest of the guys are shifting uncomfortably, and the shadows are kind of just dancing around the edge of the firelight, and they almost seem to be taking on a much more ominous shape. A couple of the others spoke up about having read similar folklore, with Eric mentioning that the Djinn were said to be able to understand all languages. Well, that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up as they realized this shadowy figure may have comprehended Jonathan's long-winded exposition in its mythical origins. Sam even swore he had heard an ethereal whisper coming from the woods at one point, like something was mimicking their voices in a bizarre unknown tongue. The fire slowly dwindled as they sat up debating whether to pack up and get the heck out of Dodge or wait until first light. Jonathan felt a little bad, thinking his ridiculous rambling might have inadvertently angered or summoned the thing, if the legends were to be believed. But just as a few of them started nodding off despite their fears, this deafening, inhuman shriek just shattered the silence, making them all jump, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, an unholy layered wail that chilled their bones. That settled it. They hurriedly broke down the campsite by the dim glow of their flashlights and peeled out of there, not even attempting to figure out what could have made such a sound. Now, in short, Jonathan's interest in ancient myths took a back seat to self-preservation after that woods-dwelling encounter with the unknown. Despite originally hoping to gain some insights into folklore from the camping trip, this experience left him wanting nothing more than to steer well clear of anything resembling the Djinn legends from then on. Now, for those who don't know, in Middle Eastern folklore, Djinn are these supernatural entities that are said to be trickster kind of spirits capable of shape-shifting and taking on all kinds of bizarre forms. Jonathan had been studying that kind of stuff for his major, so he was really fascinated by the whole concept of the Djinn. Even to this day, Jonathan stands by the fact that they encountered a Djinn up on Mount Shasta that night. However, the true identity of the mysterious entity remains unknown. In 2005, Danielle and her boyfriend Jim, they decided to go on this hiking trip up in Mount Shasta. Now, Danielle, she had been up there before when she was just a kid, and she always loved the towering mountains and all the forests surrounding it. So she thought, that this would be a great place for us to kind of just get away for a long weekend and escape the hustle and bustle of city life just for a little bit. Okay, so they packed up Danielle's old Honda Civic with all their camping gear, the tent, sleeping bags, camp stove, the whole 9 yards. And it was actually a pretty long drive from where they lived down in the East Bay area. But they didn't mind at all because the drive itself was nice once they got out into those very mountainous, forested areas north of Sacramento. And when they finally arrived up in the Mount Shasta area, the first thing they did was stop at the ranger station. They got a map and asked about some good hiking trails. And the ranger they spoke to, he was super friendly and recommended they check out this place called the Panther Meadows area for some really nice day hikes with beautiful alpine scenery and all that. And he wished them a great trip before sending them off. And so they found themselves a spot at one of the campgrounds near these meadows to set up their tent for just a couple of nights. And it was pretty cheap, just some basic campgrounds run by the Forest Service, And so after getting their camp all set up though, they decided to go explore one of the major hiking trails that the ranger had told them about. And so there they were heading up this trail towards some ridge lines overlooking the meadows. And let me tell you guys, the wildflowers were just in full bloom, which made the whole area smell incredible. Danielle, she remembers feeling totally at peace being out in that beautiful mountain environment. But then, as they reached one of the ridge lines, Danielle just stops dead in her tracks because what she saw in the distance, it made her blood run ice cold. There, way off across another ridgeline, maybe half a mile or so, was what looked like an elderly Native American man wearing this traditional attire. And as Danielle and Jim are watching, this figure suddenly contorts and glitches almost and shapeshifts into a fox, like an actual living fox. And it scampers along the ridgeline for a bit before shapeshifting right back into that old man again. Now, Danielle couldn't believe her own eyes. She remembers grabbing Jim's arm and pointing, saying something like, "Oh my gosh, did you see that?" Well, Jim had seen the whole crazy thing too and was just as freaked out as she was. And so they just stood there on that trail in total shock, watching as this figure kept alternating between man and fox a few more times off in the distance. Now, eventually, it seemed to notice them watching and just abruptly disappeared over the other side of that ridge. And Danielle and Jim, they just looked at each other completely speechless. They didn't know what in the world to make of what they had just witnessed, but they knew without a doubt that it was something not normal, like not of this world. And after taking a few minutes to try and compose themselves a little bit, they decided to just head back to their campsite, cutting the hike short for the day. But for the rest of the weekend, it just kind of passed by in this blur because neither of them could stop thinking about this unbelievable, bizarre sighting up on the ridgeline. And when they got back home afterwards, they tried telling a few friends and family members about it, but most people just thought they were joking around or messing with them. And a couple of people humored Danielle and Jim, but you could tell they didn't really believe what had happened. Now, as you could imagine, the ride home was mostly just silent, and they were both probably just trying to wrap their minds around what they had actually witnessed. And every once in a while, one of them would kind of just shake their head and mutter things like, "I can't really believe that happened." But it did happen, and as strange, as unbelievable as it seemed. And so when they finally made it back home, Danielle even remembers feeling almost relieved to be back in the familiarity and routine of normal life. Because as bizarre as their sighting was, it was also kind of traumatic in a way. Seeing something that just doesn't conform at all to what you understand as natural and normal, well, it can really shake your whole view of reality to the core. And for a while after that, Danielle found herself just constantly scanning the internet, looking for any other stories of similar encounters from people in the Mount Shasta area. She didn't find much concrete evidence, but there were plenty of accounts out there of alleged paranormal activity and unexplained phenomena that were associated with the whole region. Tales of UFO sightings, Bigfoot encounters, interdimensional gateways, and more. And it's like the more she read up on it, the more it seemed like Mount Shasta had built up this sinister reputation over the years as being a true paranormal hotspot. Now, whether any of those stories actually held any truth or not, Danielle didn't know, but it was interesting that their own sighting definitely wasn't just some total outlier for the area. And even for months afterwards, she would constantly be looking over her shoulder when she was in public, half expecting to see that shape-shifting figure trailing her. And even Jim began having these really vivid nightmares about the creature who frequently visited at night. And years after their trip, pretty much any time her or Jim would go camping or hiking, they would have these strange occurrences happen. Little things at first, like hearing strange animal noises at night that didn't sound like any known creature, or having their camp area get totally hushed by some unseen force while they were away on a day hike. And then things began escalating more and more. Stuff like Danielle waking up to find these small twig figurines arranged in a circle around their tent, or Jim's backpack going missing, only to reappear later in a completely different location than where they had originally set up camp, with all the contents rearranged. And at one point, Danielle was certain she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at them from the tree line around their campsite in the dead of night. Now, she tried pointing them out to Jim, but as soon as she did, the eyes would vanish into the darkness like they were never there to begin with. Now, could all these weird little happenings just be dismissed as pranks or the result of sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination? Maybe, maybe not. But to Danielle and Jim, it felt like a continuation of that same paranormal experience they had up at Mount Shasta, like whatever they had encountered was somehow following them. And the freakiest part is, despite all these bizarre occurrences happening while they were out camping and hiking over the years, everything would always go back to normal as soon as they returned home to the city. It was like this entity, or whatever you want to call it, could only screw with them while they were out there in the wilderness. Danielle said it even got to the point where her and Jim began questioning if they should just give up camping and hiking altogether, because the experiences were becoming too much to handle mentally and emotionally. But ultimately, they loved the outdoors too much to quit, so they just resigned themselves to the fact that they'd have to deal with these strange things from time to time on their adventures. And who knows, maybe that's exactly what this thing wanted, to not necessarily harm them, but just constantly remind them of its presence, kind of like a sick, twisted game of cat and mouse. Either way, I don't envy being in Daniel and Jim's shoes, that's for sure. Now, as far as the strange, shape-shifting man they allegedly saw that day on Mount Shasta, and its identity will remain unknown. In 1987, Audrey Schwartz was going through a pretty tough time in her life. Her marriage was falling apart, and she desperately needed to get away and clear her head. And so Audrey decided a solo hiking trip up Old Mount Shasta was just what she needed. Now, Mount Shasta had always been a special place for Audrey ever since she was a little girl. Her parents used to take her camping up there all the time when she was a kid. The crisp mountain air, the towering pines, the rushing streams. It was like a second home in a way. And so anyway, Audrey mapped out her route. She was going to take the pretty popular Avalanche Gulch Trail to around 10,000 feet and then camp for a couple of nights before heading back down. Nice and straightforward hike that she'd done plenty of times before. And the first day went great. Audrey made good time on the trail and the weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. She pitched her tent up near a nice little alpine lake once she hit her target elevation. Cracked open a bottle of wine she had packed and just tried to fully take in the serenity around her as the sun set. Audrey remembered it being one of the most beautiful sunsets she'd ever witnessed. The purples, oranges, and reds reflecting off the still water of the lake. It was almost spiritual in a way. But that night, that's when things got weird. Audrey was sleeping pretty soundly when she was woken up around 3 a.m. At first, she thought maybe it was just the cold that had roused her, but she then heard something outside her tent that made her blood run cold. It sounded like, well, Audrey knew this was going to sound crazy, but it sounded like someone or something was whispering. Just this sort of harsh, guttural whispering. And Audrey's first thought was that maybe another hiker had gotten turned around in the dark and was trying to get her attention. And so she unzipped the tent door a bit and peered out, fully expecting to see somebody's flashlight beam in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the moonlight casting these long, twisted shadows across the rocky terrain around her. And the whispering sounds continued, seeming to drift around Audrey's tent in a circle, and she began to feel really uneasy, like a golf ball was sitting in the pit of her stomach. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. Audrey tried to convince herself, yeah, that had to be it, the wind whistling through the cracks and crevices in the boulders surrounding her. And that's when Audrey heard something else that stopped her dead in her tracks. Footsteps. Unmistakable footsteps slowly circling her tent, crunching on the rocks and scraping against the dirt. Audrey's rational mind was searching for something logical, something she could explain while her primal brain was screaming at her to get out of there. And at this point, Audrey was frozen in sheer terror because part of her didn't know what to even make of the sound, and she didn't want to draw any attention to herself. But another part of her felt like she should have just stayed put, that this thing circling her would eventually make its move. And so Audrey started to panic and her breathing became more erratic. And that's when the footsteps stopped on the side of the tent closest to her, and there was just dead silence for what felt like an eternity. And then something began pressing against the tent wall, slowly, deliberately pushing inward like whatever was out there was trying to discern the shape of what was inside. And she'd never been so scared in her entire life. She could feel hot tears streaming down her cheeks as she squeezed her eyes shut as tightly as she could, trying to somehow make herself invisible. And after what seemed like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the pressing stopped. Audrey heard those same strange, unnatural footsteps slowly back away from the tent and go off into the darkness. And the whispering started again, but this time it sounded like it was getting farther and farther away until eventually it faded out completely. Now, Audrey didn't mind admitting that she had spent the rest of the night fairly sleepless, clutching her Swiss Army knife like a lifeline, her eyes just bulging in the direction of even the slightest noise. And as soon as the sun began to peek over the horizon, she tore down her campsite and got out of there as fast as her legs could carry her. Now, she's never hiked that route again, and she's not sure she ever will. When Audrey got back down to the ranger station at the base of the mountain, she was hesitant, but she had asked if there had been any other unusual reports from hikers in the area. The ranger kind of gave her a bit of a sideways glance, but he leaned in and lowered his voice, and he explained to her that she wasn't the first to come back with a story like that apparently over the years, there had been a handful of other hikers who had reported similar experiences up on the mountain. The whispering, the footsteps, the sense of being watched by something unseen. Now, as far as what it was that leaned into her tent and what caused the whispering and just her entire experience as a whole will forever remain a mystery. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment down below, Shasta is creepy. So that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we kind of go into the nitty-gritty of all things mysterious, strange, and unexplained and supernatural, then you should totally hit that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next video.